Hello and welcome. We're so happy you chose to be with us on this very special Sunday, the Sunday that we recognize as Palm Sunday, the kickoff of our Holy Week as we journey with Jesus to Jerusalem. You know, as we think about Palm Sunday, we think about all the joy that came with that day, right? On Palm Sunday, we remember that when Jesus came into the city, the crowds came out with their palm branches going back and forth and back and forth. And what were they shouting? They were shouting this: Hosanna, glory to God, right? Peace and goodwill. All those things were coming out of their mouths. They were so excited that Jesus was there. They came out in droves to see him, and they celebrated on that day. They celebrated that this man that many had heard so much about was there with them to celebrate the Passover and to celebrate all that there was. It was a good time to be in the city. But I don't think anybody fully understood what was going to happen between that Palm Sunday and Good Friday. You see, the crowds that were shouting Hosanna would soon change. They would come together in Pilate's court, and the Hosanna would be replaced with crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. In our Bible, the Gospels have different takes on that Holy Week, different ways that each person saw that week. In the Gospel of Mark, the shortest gospel of them all, Mark's take on all of this, including the whole ministry of Christ, is really to the point. Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, but Mark is also the very first of the Gospels. Oh, not in order in the Bible, but the first that we found written. As a matter of fact, Matthew and Luke will build their gospel off of what they found in Mark. And there's some interesting things within Mark's gospel. Like I said, today we celebrate Palm Sunday, but in many Christian churches, this day is a day that you choose between celebrating the Palm Sunday and also acknowledging the Passion Sunday. That's another name that we use for today, the Passion of Christ. And I find Mark's take on that to be really interesting. For me, I can feel the heart of that disciple who stood off on the side and watched everything unfold in front of him. And I want to unpack that with you today. We turn into Mark's gospel, we turn to chapter 15. That's where Mark picks it up. So much has happened between Mark chapter 11, when Jesus comes into the city, and Mark chapter 15, after he's arrested. Things like Jesus teaching about the greatest commandment, Jesus teaching about taxes, Jesus teaching about what is to come, the crucifixion, the persecution, the destruction of the temple, the betrayal that'll be done by Judas. All of that fits in between the entry and the Good Friday. But in chapter 15, we pick up the Good Friday. And in chapter 15, we read this. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus and led him away and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply. So Pilate was amazed. Pilate was amazed. Pilate was amazed at this man standing before him, at this man that they called the King of the Jews. He didn't act like a king. He most certainly didn't look like a king. And he was amazed that Jesus did not put up a defense. Pilate wasn't sure what to do with him. But I think one thing Pilate knew for sure And this was a setup. This Jesus was not guilty of anything, and most certainly should not be standing before him facing a judgment that could be as harsh as death. Well, Mark continues the story, and he says it this way. Now, at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now, a man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. Yes, he knew exactly what was going on. He knew that it was out of jealousy, that there was a backstory to this whole thing that was standing before him. It's only in the Gospel of Mark that we really get the charge that is against Barabbas. He was part of a group of insurrectionists, people who were there to overthrow the government. It's only in Mark's Gospel that we actually get a tie to the two others on the cross. They too were insurrectionists. And here, standing before the crowd, in Pilate's court, Pilate gives the people what they want. He asks them the question, who do you want me to release? This man that some claim is the king of the Jews, or this man who led an insurrection that resulted in the death of people? An insurrection to overthrow the government that Pilate is there to represent. Well, Pilate underestimated. He underestimated what the chief priests could possibly do. And while Pilate was asking the questions of the crowd, the chief priests were walking through the crowd. As Mark says, but the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. Then, what do you wish me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews? They shouted back, crucify him. Pilate asked them, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them. And after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. I always wondered, what was on the heart of Pilate? Pilate, who was there to make sure that the laws of Rome were enforced, knowing full well that there was nothing that Jesus had done to deserve death. But he had to do, right? He was in a no-win situation. If he would not release Jesus, the people were most certainly going to revolt against him and against Rome. So Pilate does what he can only do. Jesus is released. Jesus is released, and the soldiers come and get him. And in Mark's gospel, it talks about what happens next, that they clothe Jesus in this purple robe. Mark writes it this way, and they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of that purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Walking through the streets, going to that place where so many other crucifixions had happened before, the most awful way to die, not just because of the sheer pain involved, but because of the shame. because there would be crowds that would come out to watch a crucifixion. Crucifixion took time, and Mark understood that. And Mark wanted us to understand it as well. So his gospel goes on to tell us. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. That means when they rose the cross, and he hung from that cross. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified 2 rebels, one on the right and one on the left. Remember, I told you there was a connection between Barabbas and the other 2 men on the cross. Only in Mark's gospel do we get this. You see, Mark wants us to know that it should have been Barabbas. Barabbas was going to be the one on that center cross until the people had him released. Those who passed by, Mark says, derided him, shaking their heads and saying, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross. In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, he saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now so that they may see and believe. Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. Remember I said that Mark's gospel treats the other 2 that are being crucified with Jesus different than the others. Did you hear what's missing in Mark's gospel? In the other gospel recollection of this, they have one of the people on the cross tell the other to stop taunting him. That they were guilty of their crimes, but he was innocent. And he turns to Jesus and says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. The other gospel, on the cross, Jesus speaks. And he speaks words of assurance and forgiveness to one of those hanging next to him. But not in Mark's gospel. There is no forgiveness in Mark's gospel. It goes on to say, when it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. Jesus has been hanging on the cross since 9 a.m. Now at noon, God begins to be present. Present he had been with Jesus, but now present in a way for everyone else to see. And then 3 o'clock comes. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? You know, I think about, when was that moment that Jesus knew that he was the Son of God? That moment in which the young Jesus recognized that within him was God. You see, for all of his life, from the moment he recognized who he was until this moment, God and Jesus were like this. But here, as he hangs on the cross, God cannot travel with him where he's going next. God removes himself from the Son. And now Jesus feels like maybe how you and I feel from time to time. When we go through something, we wonder, where is God? Well, while God was not with him in person, God was certainly there witnessing the crucifixion. Mark goes on to say, when some of the bystanders heard it, they said, listen, he's calling for Elijah. And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a stick and gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was God's Son. a centurion. Not a priest, not a Pharisee, not a scribe, not even one of his disciples or a follower, a Roman centurion, an outsider. He is the one who says, truly, Jesus was God's Son. Of course, it's fitting, isn't it? I mean, Jesus taught that the Son of God came not just for the chosen, not just for the Jewish people, but for all, including the Gentiles, which means including the Roman centurion. You know, I envision Mark, like I said, off on the side, all the emotions as he looked at the crosses, as he looked at what was happening, the sadness, the grief, the anger, the resentment. Maybe that's why Mark doesn't remember Jesus forgiving one of those hanging with him on the cross. Maybe when he shared this story, he was still coming to terms, coming to grips with what they had done, not fully understanding that this was part of a plan. Yes, on Palm Sunday, we celebrate the triumphant entry. But I appreciate Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel that takes us from that celebration, with the crowd shouting Hosanna, to the crowd at Pilate's courtyard shouting crucify him, to Golgotha, where Jesus will breathe his last, taking the sins of the world. Friends, let us journey together this week. Let us journey together with Jesus. And let us wait with anticipation for the resurrection of Easter morn. Amen.
Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotlessly white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Walking daily by the Savior's side, are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Do you rest each moment in the crucified? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotlessly white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Lay aside your garments that are stained with sin, and be washed in the blood of the Lamb. There's a fountain flowing for the soul unclean, and be washed in the blood of the Lamb. Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotlessly white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotlessly white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the